This week on the Communicators, a discussion on a recent report from the FCC that looks at competition in the wireless industry. Joining us to discuss the results are Christopher Guttman-McCabe of the Wireless Association and Matt Wood of the consumer group Free Press.
Well, the Federal Communications Commission recently issued its congressionally mandated annual report on competition in the wireless industry. This is the 15th annual report. That's our topic this week on the Communicators. Here's the conclusion of the Federal Communications Commission. The 15th report makes no formal finding as to whether there is or is not effective competition in the industry. Rather, given the complexity of the various interrelated segments and services within the mobile wireless ecosystem, the report focuses on presenting the best data available on competition throughout this sector of the economy. Well, joining us to discuss this issue is Matt Wood of the policy group Free Press. He's their policy director. And Chris Guttman-McCabe of CTIA, the Wireless Association. He's the vice president. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Matt Wood, as soon as this report came out, Free Press issued a statement saying that the wireless industry is not competitive. Why?
We think it's not effectively competitive because we have two dominant companies, Verizon Wireless and AT&T, serving more customers than anyone else, taking in more profits and revenues than anyone else, and there are other players around the edges. There are obviously more than one provider out there, but we think there are too many structural barriers to entry and growth by these competitive options that consumers should have better access to, and that the consumers don't reap the benefits of having multiple providers because we have two such dominant players controlling such a large portion of the industry.
Matt Wood, what do you think about the fact that the FCC did not take a position on competition?
Well, we certainly do think that there is enough evidence to conclude that the industry is not effectively competitive, that the FCC did a good job in presenting all the complex data and analysis that they're talking about. It is a complicated picture, but it is one that the evidence to us points to a single conclusion, which is that there is not enough effective competition between the big two and the other providers out there. And of course, that ultimately hurts consumers if their competitive options are limited and if they don't have as many options as they might, especially for truly high-end plans, for the most popular smartphones, for the most popular devices, and if they're funneled into one provider or another based on structural barriers that keep competitors out of that picture.
And we will touch on those issues a little later, but we want to hear from Chris Guttman-McCabe also of the wireless industry. What's your conclusion about the wireless industry itself?
Well, not surprisingly, I disagree with Matt. I think by any measure, it's an effectively competitive industry. I think if you look at the number of options that consumers have, I think that the report says that 90% of Americans have access to 5 or more facilities-based competitors. That doesn't take into consideration the numerous resellers that are out there. I think if you look at whether it's the price per minute or the average bill is half of what it was in 1987, around the beginning of the industry. And if you think what is being delivered to consumers, the fact that the bill has been cut in half is pretty staggering, and it continues to go down every quarter, every year. It goes down, no matter whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics measuring it or anyone. And so, you can look at marketing and advertising. 3 of our largest providers are among the top 10 advertisers in the country. You can look at innovation. You can look at capital expenditures. I mean, everything suggests that this is an industry that really goes to battle with each other over serving consumers. So we obviously would have liked a conclusion that it was effectively competitive, and yet we are happy that the Commission has begun to look at this wireless industry as an ecosystem. It's a term that we coined about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, looking at the wireless space, and believe that it is an ecosystem, and it's a growing, sort of breathing ecosystem. But from the pure perspective of drawing a competitive or not competitive, we just can't see how one could conclude that this is not an effectively competitive.
Mr. Guttman-McCabe, how much of the data did CTIA provide to the FCC for this report?
Sure. So we, throughout the year, we will make filings to the FCC. Probably a fair percentage of the information in the report comes from CTIA, and yet I've been at CTIA for 10 years now. Over the last 10 years, the Commission has used more and more of its own independent or third-party data. The reality is the majority of data that we provide to the Commission is not CTIA generated. It's actually third-party data that we've gathered, whether it's Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, or other organizations. We tend to find it and then present it to the FCC as sort of independent data. That which does come specifically from CTIA is part of a semi-annual survey that we've been doing for about 20 years now that is submitted by our members and put through an accounting firm and aggregated and pieced together before it even makes its way to CTIA.
Matt Wood, does that affect the quality of the data, do you think, with CTIA providing it?
I think that CTIA provides some valuable data and that other parties do as well. We've often said that the FCC can and should collect more of its own data, do more of its own independent analysis of what they're receiving from third parties, but also go out and subpoena people, frankly, I mean, not to put it in too stark a term, but to get the data from industry that is proprietary, that is not readily shared. The FCC doesn't need to put that out there. It can be submitted under protective orders. It can be kept from competitors. But the FCC needs to do a better job of actually gathering data and not simply relying on what comes to it from CTIA and other third parties and other analysts who might have a stake in the industry or who might have a very easily colored opinion of what makes an industry competitive or not.
We're pleased to be joined by our Communicators regular, Paul Kirby, who is a senior editor with Telecommunications Reports.
Thanks. Let's dig down a little. The report says that the index used by regulators to measure concentration in the industry was 2848 by the middle of 2010. That's slightly higher than it was in 2008, but it's nearly 700 points higher than 2003. Antitrust authorities, just to give a sense, usually say 2,500 is a market that's highly concentrated. Should this be a concern for regulators and consumers? If Chris, if you want to
Sure.
start.
Well, so you're referring to HHI, and HHI measures concentration, not competition. And so when we look at HHI numbers, the same report that you're referencing, shortly after it gives those numbers, suggests that, or states that the United States has the second lowest HHI among all of the developed world in terms of sort of the raw numbers. And so I think you have to look at a market and how it is structured. This is an extremely capital-intensive market. It requires capital expenditures a significant amount each year. And so you see a marketplace in the United States that differs from those around the world for the positive in terms of how the consumers see it. Our top carriers have a significant less percentage of this market than the top carriers have in every other market on the planet. And so I think if you look at it in terms of, has the number increased? Yes, the number has increased, but that's a measure of concentration, not competition. At the same time that number has increased, the average price and the monthly price to consumers has gone down. So I think we look at it in the context of, that's a number that is, it's a simple calculation, although to be honest with you, I don't quite know how the FCC comes up with those numbers. I've tried myself with an economics degree from Swarthmore. That's what I used to do for 5 years before I went to law school, and I can't replicate their numbers, but yet in that same report they suggest that it's the second lowest on the planet. So,
I would agree with Chris that it measures concentration, not competition, but I think the problem is that we're not seeing effective competition in terms of carrier conduct in that concentrated marketplace. We do have two large dominant carriers and other very large providers as well, and when one of them raises their pricing for text messages, the others follow suit quickly without any retribution or without a loss of customers because there aren't a lot of options. There aren't carriers offering differently priced options and plans. When one of them raises their early termination fees, for example, that are used to lock people into their contracts and punish them for going away from the service before the contract is up, the others follow suit very quickly when it's on a smartphone or whether it's on a feature phone or some less data-intensive plan. When one of them goes to a tiered pricing plan or any sort of data usage cap system, such as AT&T, earlier this year, and now Verizon following suit, we quickly see that kind of follow leader mentality where if one carrier does it and is able to make money from that, then the other carriers follow suit. And so while HHI is a concern to us and we think that the more concentrated the market is, the less likely we are to see competition, that's, we think, borne out by the parallel conduct that we see and the fact that consumers are more or less stuck with a service plan that they don't necessarily like and yet aren't able to get out of because of high switching costs, because of those early termination fees that I mentioned, because of an inability to go to the best plan for that particular customer when they've been told by their provider, if you want to use a certain kind of phone or if you want to not pay a penalty for leaving us, you must stay with us for that entire time.
Now, one other thing, Chris, you noted the report talked about how many carriers Americans can choose from. But it also talked about that while 94% of Americans have access to 4 or more wireless voice providers, only 68% have access to that many broadband providers. So does this mean there's a need for more competition in the broadband market?
Well, I think one thing we have to, I think, make clear for the viewers is that this is a report that looks at 2009. Okay, so it's not even 2010, and here we are in 2011. So the majority of the data is for 2009. And when you look at what was happening in 2009 with regard to broadband, we were still, as an industry, moving to 3G, and certainly hadn't really introduced much in the way of 4G or WiMAX or LTE at that point in time. If you move forward already to where we are now, the United States has 92% of the world's LTE subscribers and 77% of the world's WiMAX subscribers. So we're clearly on the cutting edge of both of those advanced technologies. And you're seeing, again, even in the 10 years that I've been at CTIA, we've moved from analog to second generation or digital technology to third generation to 3.5 to fourth generation, depending upon how you define that. I know that's up for debate, but the reality is, 4 sort of wholesale technology change-outs in 10 years, I think it's pretty staggering that we are still, within that time frame, leading the world in terms of the highest speed networks and the most subscribers on those networks.
Well, I think what Chris didn't answer there was how many, you asked about how many broadband providers there are available to people on a wireless basis. And while there is obviously a growing demand for and really a growing need for wireless services, this is becoming an essential feature for people. More and more people are cutting the cord and only using their wireless phone for voice. More and more people, especially low-income people, are not able to have a broadband subscription at home on their desktop and also a wireless one, and so they're choosing that wireless connection. It's becoming more and more of an essential feature that is part of people's lives. And while the demand is growing and the providers are obviously growing their overall output, the question that remains unanswered is whether or not we would have lower pricing for consumers if there was more competition. Just simply looking at the number of providers doesn't take into account the relative market shares of those providers and their ability to set a premium price that people will be forced to pay or will choose to pay if they want to get access to the iPhone or to some other fancy handset, and if they want to be able to have the true power of a mobile broadband connection available to them rather than something that is more limited by a smaller carrier that maybe doesn't have the same kinds of offerings that the largest carriers are able to make available to their customers.
Paul, if I may, 2 points. Matt keeps talking about higher prices, and yet the report and facts bear out that the prices aren't higher. They continue to go down. Without exception, they continue to go down. Whether it's texting prices. Matt said, one carrier raises a price of text and the others follow. Well, the prices aren't going up. They're going down. And the broadband, the data prices have halved in terms of the price per bit just in the last 12 months. We've had discussions, Peter, I've been with you before on the show, and we've talked about things like the iPhone and how everyone had to have the iPhone. And it's an iconic device, no doubt. And yet now I'm having discussions with foreign regulators about, well, how do they address the fact that the Android platform and Google is taking a tremendous share of handset sales, and should people be protecting against the Android platform? And if you look back at what we've said over the last couple of years is, as quickly as someone controls a market, that quickly they can lose control in this space. And the greatest illustration is 2.5 years ago, the hottest selling handset was a flip phone from Motorola Razr. 2.5 years ago. In those 2.5 years, we've gone through the iPhone and Android devices to tablets, and we've gone from 0 apps to over 1.2 million applications are available now. So this is a market that moves so incredibly quickly that the issues that Matt and others at Free Press complained about a year ago are already completely overtaken by events.
And Matt, what if you would respond to what Mr. Guttman-McCabe just had to say?
Sure. I mean, I think that when you look at the fact that the handsets are changing, that's not surprising. Also not surprising to us is who is controlling that playing field. The entire vertical distribution chain and value chain, as the report refers to it sometimes, is controlled by the largest operators. So even though the iPhone is now popular and it's being caught up and passed by the Android operating system, it's the same carriers at the top of that chain, AT&T and Verizon and Sprint and T-Mobile to some extent, who get the first crack at that new device, whether it's the Razr, whether it's the iPhone, whether it's the Droid, whether it's tomorrow's iteration of those same devices. So we see a lot of repeat players involved in that space, and not necessarily the fact that the technology is changing is not surprising. but neither is the fact that you still have these dominant players who are at the top of that chain, controlling that pace of innovation and who has access first to those devices.
Well, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about Verizon and AT&T here. This report is from 2009. Matt Wood, in your view, if the proposed merger between AT&T and T-Mobile happens, how will that affect competition? Because T-Mobile is considered a separate entity in this report.
It is, and it still is a separate entity until such time as that deal goes through. We think that would be disastrous for competition because we do have T-Mobile as a lower-priced option. Not this report as much, but the previous competition report talked about the fact that T-Mobile and Sprint acted as some sort of check on the prices that AT&T and Verizon could charge. Not completely. They weren't completely disciplining their pricing because they didn't have access to the same handsets and to the same types of applications that AT&T and Verizon are able to lock up on an exclusive basis at the outset. But it would be the elimination of a lower-priced competitor who has been an innovator in lots of other ways. T-Mobile was one of the first to bring Android operating system phones to market and consistently offers lower prices than do AT&T and Verizon. We think that taking that away and obviously lessening the number of nationwide competitors from 4 to 3 would be a very big disaster for competition in this space.
Mr. Guttman-McCabe.
Peter, I thoroughly like my job at CTIA, and so I am going to say that the merger is going to go through a rigorous process at the FCC and at the Department of Justice, and I look forward to seeing what the outcome is.
Chris, why don't you just tell us what you think, and we won't tell anyone else.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. We're discussing the recent FCC report on competition in the wireless industry. We're pleased to be joined by representatives from the wireless industry, Chris Guttman-McCabe, Vice President, and from Free Press, a think tank, policy group that looks at these telecommunications issues. Matt Wood is the policy director. Paul Kirby of Telecommunications reports. Next question.
Now, many years this report, this annual report to Congress is released, and it doesn't get much attention. This year, one reason it does is because of the merger that the FCC and Justice are considering. Groups and companies who are opposed to the merger have already tried to use their report saying, look, they did not determine this effective competition for the second year in a row. That shows the merger should not be approved. AT&T has said, well, even though they didn't determine that, we think it shows how many carriers people have choices of. Wanted to get your views on, from the politics standpoint, if you think this report will continue to be used, if you will, by the two sides in the merger proceeding.
I'm sure that people will continue to use it. I think more important than what the report says, though, and not to cheapen the report, it's an important document, an important body of work that the FCC has assembled, but I think more important is the underlying dockets and proceedings at the FCC that the report looks to. And what's more important to the ultimate outcome of whether or not the industry remains competitive is whether the FCC pushes those levers that it can in order to promote competition and to level the playing field and make entry and growth by smaller carriers more possible and more profitable for them, frankly. I think Chris's answer on the merger is indicative of a larger problem that the CTIA has in some respects. They do have members on both sides of the merger, with Sprint obviously very vociferously opposing the merger and pointing out the harms to competition and consumers that they see stemming from that merger if it goes through. When it comes to these other issues that the FCC is weighing and that are really just a small part of the wireless competition report, but are certainly important in terms of what the FCC can do to change the law, change the regulatory playing field, things like backhaul and data roaming and interoperability and all these other things that we spend a lot of time arguing about here in DC. Those are the kinds of places that we would like to see more movement, and that's where we think the report could conclude there was a lack of effective competition, and at the very least, a lot of barriers to competition and to entry and growth by smaller providers. I think that's more important ultimately for the merger and for the FCC's overall take on the industry. But again, CTIA is obviously, it has members on both sides of a lot of these issues, the merger being the one at the forefront of most people's minds right now, but on all these other issues too, as to whether or not the market is really effectively competitive or not, or whether there are large barriers to entry that prevent people from really getting up to the same rung and competing with AT&T and Verizon and the other largest carriers.
Chris Guttman-McCabe, if you would respond to FCC Commissioner Michael Kopp's statement regarding this wireless report. I cannot ignore some of the darkening clouds over the state of mobile competition. The headline for this report will be that the FCC neither finds nor does not find effective competition. Dig deeper, and for sure, we find ongoing trends of industry consolidation.
So I think if you look at, you know, and with all due respect to Commissioner Copps. I think if you focus on one specific area, is the HHI as measured by the FCC getting higher? I think the answer is yes, and you can't deny that. And yet, I think if you look at the other 329 pages of the document, you see an industry that is, for all intents and purposes, violently competitive. You see, again, as I've said, prices going down. You see innovation up. If this were not a competitive industry, why would there be $21 billion in capital expenditures in 2009 and $25 billion in 2010? You know, why would you see prices continue to go down? Matt talks about sort of new entry. Leap and Metro during this time period when it was measured went from very small regional providers to pretty significant, you know, larger providers who are working to try to get a national footprint. During the same time period, Clearwire jumped into the market and became a participant. Cox decided that it was going to enter the wireless market. Comcast worked with some other cable providers to purchase spectrum. So, you know, I look at this and I say all of those things suggest that there is competition going on. Are there barriers? Certainly there are barriers. One of them is that it's extremely capital intensive to enter this market. Another one is that you can't just make a decision and start. You need spectrum. We've been pushing hard for the last several years. The Chairman Janikowski, commissioners, the President of the United States mentioned the need to bring spectrum to market in his State of the Union address. Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate all have identified the need to bring more spectrum to market. I agree to Matt. I would love the opportunity for everyone to get as much spectrum as they want and allow them all just to compete without having to worry about infrastructure. So that's key. From our perspective. But I think if you want to pick and choose and want to find individual statistics within this report to raise concerns, that's a possibility. But I don't think when you look at the entirety of the report, there's any way to conclude that there is not effective competition.
Paul Kirby, next question.
Matt, you mentioned something called backhaul. What backhaul is, it allows cell sites the carriers operate, it allows those to be connected basically back to the network. And that's a big concern of smaller carriers. Their contention is that AT&T and Verizon basically have the backhaul market locked up. Those two major carriers say there are plenty of alternatives and they're open to reaching agreements. The report talks about backhaul and what's called special access and says that's something that needs to be addressed. Give us a sense of why you think the backhaul market is a problem, and then if Chris wants to address that as well.
Well, again, I think that you know, we at Free Press and other public interest organizations have made this case, but so have a lot of carriers, Sprint and T-Mobile, before this merger, although they've gotten a little more quiet about these kinds of things now, understandably enough, I suppose, have pointed to the very high profit margins, or I think Sprint actually called them obscene profits at one point in time, that not just AT&T and Verizon are making, but also the other major dominant wireline provider, now CenturyLink, I suppose, but Quest, when Sprint was last complaining about this. It's not that there aren't other options for backhaul, but it is that these competitors are so reliant upon their largest competing wireless providers, the vertically integrated AT&T and Verizon, who not only have the wireline side, but also are wireless providers and can essentially self-provision a lot of what they're using to connect their towers back to the internet and back to the phone network. So we definitely feel that there are barriers there that not just the public interest organizations or people like me have pointed out, but that other carriers have pointed out and shown to be a very high percentage of the costs that they're incurring in order to provide service and compete with those who control a large percentage of that special access supply.
Chris, anything?
I mean, I think this is an area, and there are, you know, a couple that Matt mentioned that we would hope would be worked out by, you know, within the industry. When we look at these sorts of issues, our initial hope is if it's an intra-industry issue, or if it's an issue that can be worked out among our members, we really try to facilitate that and make that happen to the extent that it can. So, but again, it's something before the commission, and I think rightly so. It's something that the commission should make a determination one way or the other as to what needs to happen.
Chris Guttman-McCabe, there are about 300 million wireless users or handsets available at this time in the United States. Of the prime real estate for such handsets, AT&T, Verizon, according to this report, the wireless report, control about 80% of that prime real estate when it comes to spectrum. Is that something we should be concerned about? Does that put a dent in competition?
Well, so it depends. I would argue no at this moment, although you know, the Commission is moving forward to try to bring more spectrum to market. I think, again, if you define spectrum as just being the cellular spectrum, then yes, AT&T and Verizon do specifically control that. But I also think that the Commission has attempted to bring other bands of spectrum to market, and we've pushed specifically to have other bands below 1 gigahertz, this sort of beachfront spectrum to market. The reality is that AT&T, Verizon ended up with that spectrum because that's how the government initially gave it out. Since that point in time, there has been a move towards auctions and allowing people to participate in auctions. And I think, yes, there are definitely some real positives in terms of economies of scale of having the lower spectrum because you can get better propagation characteristics out of it. And that's why we are pushing to reallocate you know, a fair amount of the broadcast spectrum now to allow others to enjoy those benefits. But I do think you have to look at the package as a whole in terms of competition, and it's not just where you have your bands of spectrum, but have you built out, is there a reasonable price for the equipment, is there enough spectrum in those bands that you're gaining some, not just United States, but international economies. If you really think about it, when it comes to infrastructure technology, almost all the vendors are not in the United States. They're outside the United States, and they're building their infrastructure technology for, you know, an ecosystem that extends well outside you know, our borders. So we push in this context to have spectrum that is internationally harmonized so that it drives down the cost, so that when they build technology, whether it's for Sprint or US Cellular or AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile, they're also building that technology for Orange or some of the other foreign carriers, and therefore driving the cost down. But to me, the solution is bring more spectrum. I think Matt and I would agree on this pretty strongly. Bring more spectrum to market, remove any of the potential barriers from that perspective. If you bring it below 1 gigahertz, then you're leveling the playing field for everyone who wants to get access to that, and I think that's the right approach.
We would agree in some respects on that. I think getting more spectrum into the hands of people who can use it and into different providers' hands is an important thing. Chris is right that the cellular licenses were essentially given to AT&T and Verizon, or at least to their predecessors, as they consolidated over the years. In the 700 megahertz auction, though, the most recent auction of this beachfront spectrum, as it's sometimes called, below 1 gigahertz, AT&T and Verizon won at auction the largest portion of those licenses. And interestingly enough, this points to another barrier to entry and growth by competitors. Other entities did get some of that 700 megahertz spectrum, and yet AT&T and Verizon have used their technical dominance and their economic dominance to look at engineering ways around that competition that might arise in the 700 megahertz band, lack of interoperability, so that if I'm a smaller wireless provider and I have a phone that works on my particular license in that 700 megahertz swath, it might not work on Verizon's or AT&T's. They've not only won the largest percentage of licenses at auction, in addition to having them given to them in the first place, but they've also found ways to keep other people out of their space by limiting the devices that are available to smaller providers in that respect as well. So we see continued domination by the largest carriers in the auction space. When it comes to getting more TV band spectrum into use for broadband, that's something that we've certainly talked about as well. I think that Free Press and others have made the case for unlicensed spectrum use in that same band, making more spectrum available for use, but not necessarily only by the largest carriers, by all sorts of innovators, and frankly by the largest carriers too. We see AT&T today offloading as much as 40% of iPhone traffic onto Wi-Fi networks. And that will be a trend that we think will continue to use spectrum in not only more intensively, but also smarter ways to make it unlicensed, to make it something that is shared and something that can be reused more frequently and more cheaply by innovators who want to come into the space and not necessarily have to go through AT&T and Verizon to offer their services.
Paul Kirby, final question.
As we talk about spectrum allocations, is there a concern, Chris, at CTIA that the Commerce Department is looking right now at spectrum in the 1.7 gigahertz band, that spectrum that the industry really, really wants? However, the Defense Department and other agencies are using that spectrum. How concerned are you that it will take too long to free that spectrum up? That it might not be within the 10 years that NTIA, which is the agency looking at that, would hope to free that up if it decides it can be?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that going forward, I'm not aware of, I don't think we're ever going to find any greenfield spectrum that isn't encumbered in some way. The way we look at it is if you can get the government focusing on a significant amount of spectrum. 500 megahertz is what right now they're focusing on. And you can get them focusing on some of it in the commercial space and some of it in the government space. And you can try to move each of those forward. You have the likelihood that you will have a sort of a rolling out of spectrum over time. Some of it sooner, some of it later. We certainly have pushed hard, Paul, you referenced it, for our desire for 1755 to 1780 megahertz to be made available. I know that NTIA is looking at 1755 all the way up to 1850. We believe the focus, at least initially, should be on that initial swath, and everything should be done that can be done, short of causing harm to our national security, of course, but everything that can be done should be done to reallocate that spectrum. And then, to Matt's point earlier about Verizon and AT&T winning the lion's share of 700 megahertz, I don't want to be a defender of those two, yet Sprint and T-Mobile didn't participate in the auction. What we're hoping is we can bring a very large swath of spectrum to market at one point in time, 100, 200 megahertz, and allow everyone who wants to participate the chance to come there and buy fungible assets.
And that's Communicators for this week on C-SPAN. Our guests, Chris Guttman-McCabe of the wireless industry, Matt Wood of Free Press, and Paul Kirby of Telecommunications Reports. Gentlemen, thank you. The report, if you're interested in reading the 15th Annual Wireless Competition Report of the FCC, is hyperlinked at our website, cspan.org/communicators.